G'day, my name's Dev. I'm here on Larrakia country in Darwin at the top end of Australia's Northern Territory. Behind me are some fortifications that were built during World War II to defend Darwin from a possible Japanese invasion. In this episode I'll discuss the manifestation of our Anzac Legend. It started with the Australian-New Zealand Army Corps that was sent to support the British invasion of Turkey during World War I, which was the Gallipoli Campaign. And although this campaign was ultimately defeated, Australian soldiers were seen to have exhibited great initiative, endurance and heroism. Today, the Gallipoli Campaign is seen as the beginning of our national consciousness. On the 25th of April every year, our nation celebrates Anzac Day by paying respect to all those who've served in our armed forces and, most importantly, those who have been killed or wounded in combat zones overseas. In our postmodern society, nothing is sacred, and Anzac Day is the only real day of the year when we seem to take ourselves and our history seriously. It is important to begin this story with the metaphysical acknowledgement that the Anzac legend is a consequence of modern warfare, which is itself a consequence of the intensely competitive tradition that developed amongst Eurasian peoples over the past 3,000 years. Like aggressive bacteria, they conquered each other until great empires emerged that conquered the world. The Australian continent and its first peoples were cocooned from this annihilating global revolution until the British arrived at Sydney Cove in 1788. But this does not mean that traditional societies were necessarily passive. Like Aboriginality itself, the Indigenous response to Europeans entering their lands varied from region to region. Some welcomed the newcomers, but others fought back like demons. For example, in 1884, amongst the ancient hills around Mount Isa in outback Queensland, hundreds of Kalkadoon warriors fought to the death in a pitched battle against a heavily armed white posse. Once colonisation was arguably completed, Australia federated in 1901 and the Australian Defence Force was born. The First World War provided the first opportunity for these new Australian soldiers to prove both their loyalty to the British Empire and their bravery in battle. Australia's enthusiasm for the war was exceptional. The first news of it was marked by the prolonged ringing of church bells, long parades and brass bands. There were formal pledges of loyalty to the King and of course patriotic send-offs to the tens of thousands of young men departing for the war. It is also important to acknowledge the darker side of this exceptional enthusiasm. In rural Australia, residents of German descent were harassed and vilified. But why did such an extraordinarily high number of Australian men sign up for a bloody war on the other side of the planet? The famous Australian writer Don Watson explains that back then there could be no loyalty to Australia without loyalty to the British throne, and volunteering for service was real evidence of that higher loyalty. To not go was to miss the party, the adventures, your mates. It meant to stay at home on the farm and be deemed a coward. I recommend reading his fine book, The Bush. These Australians who enlisted for World War I joined our New Zealand cousins for overseas service as part of the Australasian Army Corps. It was the practice of the time for Aussies and Kiwis to compete together as Australasians during sporting events. However, complaints from New Zealanders led to the adoption of a more suitable title, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. This was quickly abbreviated to Anzac, and the troops within it were soon sent to support the British-led invasion of Turkey as part of the Gallipoli Campaign. This was an ambitious attempt by the Commonwealth forces to knock Turkey out of the war by separating Constantinople from the rest of the Ottoman Empire. Due to the overconfidence of the British command, the campaign failed and resulted in protracted trench warfare, which saw great heroism and heavy casualties on both sides. It is important to remember that the British Empire was an international empire, and the Commonwealth forces at Gallipoli included not only Australian soldiers, but also New Zealanders, Englishmen, Irishmen, Senegalese and Indian troops. After 8 long months, the Gallipoli campaign was abandoned and the invasion force withdrawn. The Anzacs were then moved to the endless trench systems of the Western Front, where they fought with distinction in those massive horrific battles that characterised the First World War. The Australian infantry reinforced the Anzac Legend when they stopped the German advance at Villers-Bretonneux on the Somme. It is important to remember that tens of thousands of Australians fell on the Western Front and that they played a leading role in breaking through the Hindenburg Line, which was the last major Allied offensive of the war. My great-grandfather, Bobby Turner, was there in the trenches as a teenage soldier from Wollongong. It must have been a horrible and traumatic experience, but he survived, and remembering his service is very important to me. The Anzac Legend emerged from the Gallipoli Campaign. It was first expressed by the English journalist Ellis Ashmead Bartlett in his reports of the landing at Anzac Cove, but it was taken forward and expanded by the famous Australian war correspondent Charles Bean. Bean was an extraordinary historian, among many other things, and no other Australian has been more influential in shaping the way we remember and commemorate the sacrifices of World War I in this country. Bean argued that of all the Australian traditions, everything we hold dear, none is held more dearly than the Anzac tradition. There is nothing else in Australian society that so expresses a sense of national unity. He was correct. Anzac Day is one of our longest running traditions. However, it is still very much rooted in the exceptionalism of the toughness and brotherhood of Australian males. Indeed, the concept suggests that in the combat zone, Aussies and Kiwis possess shared characteristics beyond that of other soldiers from other nations. You only have to look at Australian art from the preceding colonial era to see the inherent celebration of the brotherhood of men and the virtue of hard work in the Australian bush. Indeed, many of the Anzacs came from the bush, and they possessed traditional Australian characteristics of larrikinism, egalitarianism, innovation and hard work. They were seen to possess a sardonic sense of humour and accept the dangers of warfare, but reject unnecessary social restrictions like class, which was so prevalent in British society of the time. The Gallipoli Campaign is associated with the beginning of Australia's national consciousness. Indeed, Australia federated only a decade before Gallipoli. At this time, the Australian government was actively trying to establish a new all-white nation, and they wanted a European army to represent them. This meant that Indigenous people were legally exempt from military service in Australia. But they joined up anyway, and for many of the same reasons as their Caucasian countrymen: patriotism, loyalty and adventure. It's thought that about 1,000 Aboriginal men enlisted into the Australian Army during World War I, but it's hard to tell because their race was usually only subtly mentioned on their recruitment paperwork as euphemisms like dark complexion, curly dark hair, dark eyes. It is true that the Anzacs were mostly white Australian men of Anglo and Celtic descent. However, it is important to remember that many also came from Australia's rich ethnic and cultural diversity. For example, Billy Singh was the most famous Australian sniper at Gallipoli. He is credited with almost 300 confirmed kills. His father was a Chinese stockman, originally from Shanghai. Chinese Australians represent the second largest and second oldest ancestral influence on Australia's population. They have had a substantial and ongoing influence on Australian culture, especially with food, but also through business, local politics, media and the arts. I recommend reading about the extraordinary life and service of Mi Quong Tut. The Anzac Legend was galvanised in World War II by the bravery of Australian soldiers in the deserts of North Africa and the Middle East and the jungles of Southeast Asia. While there wasn't the same rush of volunteers like there was for World War I, a high proportion of Australian men of military age joined up. They fought the Waffen-SS in Greece and then Crete, and they fought the Vichy French in Syria and Lebanon. They fought the Italian Navy in the Mediterranean Sea and the Luftwaffe in the skies above Europe. They successfully defended the port city of Tobruk from the Afrikaner Corps and then helped stop the Nazi advance indefinitely at the battles of El Alamein. Then Japan entered the war, attacked Pearl Harbor and poured into Southeast Asia. They easily captured the British stronghold of Singapore, and suddenly Australia felt very alone. Against Britain's interests, Our wartime leader, John Curtin, ordered most of our troops home to defend us against a possible Japanese invasion. The Pacific Campaign was characterised by intense jungle warfare, vast naval engagements and brutality on both sides. The Australians stopped the Japanese for the first time at Milne Bay and then again on the gruelling Kokoda Track. The Americans left us out of the major battles at Guadalcanal, Tarawa and Okinawa, but fighting the Japanese brought us closer to America and further away from Britain. This change in our strategic direction is a watershed moment in the history of our foreign affairs. The war in the Pacific brought tens of thousands of American servicemen to Australia and formed cultural connections that continue to this day. From 1942 into 1943, Northern Australia became the Allied front line against Japanese expansion. The military took control of civilian areas and thousands were evacuated down south as a fierce air and naval war raged across the top end. Aboriginal people were brought in from the bush and enlisted to build runways and support long-range reconnaissance missions. We were attacked over 100 times. Places were bombed, ships were sunk, planes were shot out of the sky, and many people were killed. Lest we forget. Following World War II, Australian soldiers joined the Americans in a series of long and complex foreign wars in Asia and then the Middle East. Firstly in Korea, where Australian diggers fought bravely in savage frozen battles against enormous Chinese forces at Yongyu, Kapyong and Mariangsan. Then in Vietnam, where our involvement began with a small commitment of 30 expert military advisors in 1962 and increased over the following years to peak at over 7,600 personnel in 1965. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, the AATTV, was a specialist unit of ADF advisors who operated during the war. Its members worked individually or in small groups and operated throughout the countryside where they provided training and assistance to South Vietnamese forces. It is one of the most decorated units within Australian military history. Its members received over 100 decorations, including 4 Victoria Crosses. Due to concerns about the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, Australia's involvement in Vietnam enjoyed initial widespread community support. However, an increasingly powerful anti-war movement developed from the left, and consequently the Anzac Legend began to fade from general society through the 1970s. But all was not lost, and possibly due to the release of the epic Australian film Gallipoli in 1981, there was a resurgence in popular commemorations of Anzac Day that continue to this day. This has brought the Anzac Legend back to prominence within Australian political discourse. Since then, more and more Australians are attending Anzac Day dawn services across the country. Indeed, every Australian suburb and country town seems to have an Anzac memorial. The Anzacs have become an Australian legend, though some critics refer to it as a myth. But I don't think it is necessarily hero worship. The Australian historian Ken Inglis believed that our war memorial is a 20th century concept which memorialised the human cost of war rather than the victorious outcome. We tend to celebrate the sacrifice of ordinary soldiers, both the returned and the fallen, rather than focusing on the commanders who led them. Due to time, I'm forced to leave out much of Australia's eclectic military history. But to me, the Anzac tradition is a necessary romanticisation of the endurance of actual Australian values like mateship and egalitarianism through the hell of war. As a veteran myself, I would like to finish this episode by acknowledging all the men and women who have served this country, and especially those who have paid the ultimate sacrifice, lest we forget.